Zix adjusted his ceremonial combat sash for the 14th time that morning, his forearms moving in perfect synchronization as he preened before the gleaming surface of his office wall. The iridescent metal reflected back the image he'd spent centuries perfecting, the very picture of a distinguished Centaurian combat master. All 6 of his eyes blinked in sequence, a habit his mother had always said made him look pretentious. But what did she know? She'd only been a simple zero-gravity dance instructor. Computer, display today's class roster, he commanded, his primary vocal cords vibrating with the perfect resonance that had made him famous throughout 3 galactic sectors. The holographic display shimmered to life, showing the profiles of the 20 most promising combat specialists the Galactic Federation had to offer. Well, 19 promising specialists, and whatever clerical error had allowed that human into his class. Computer, verify admission credentials, for he squinted at the offensive entry. Lieutenant Maya Chen. Credentials verified, the AI chirped back, somehow managing to sound smugger than a machine had any right to be. Lieutenant Chen's combat scores exceed minimum requirements by 47%. Additional note: special dispensation granted by Admiral K. Thorne himself. Zix secondary heart skipped a beat. K. Thorne. That ancient battle-axe never granted special anything to anyone. The last time he'd made an exception was, well, for Zix himself, 3 centuries ago. Fascinating, he muttered, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. I suppose we'll see how long this experiment lasts. Computer time. Class begins in 3 minutes. Combat Master. With a flourish that sent his ceremonial sash rippling in ways that defied several laws of physics, Zix strode from his office toward the Academy's premier combat arena. His footsteps echoed off the polished corridors, each click of his boots perfectly timed to project authority, confidence, and just a hint of impending doom for any student who dared to disappoint him. The arena doors parted before him like supplicants before a king. Inside, 19 of the galaxy's finest young warriors stood at perfect attention. Their species varied from the crystalline Pyraxians to the gaseous nebulons contained in their environmental suits, but all radiated the kind of deadly competence that made lesser beings wake up in cold sweats. And then there was the human, standing at the end of the line, somehow managing to look both perfectly regulations compliant and subtly insubordinate, and at the same time. Zix had to admit, it was quite a trick. Welcome, he announced, letting his voice carry the weight of 300 years of combat experience, to advanced tactical combat integration. You are here because someone somewhere believes you have what it takes to join the ranks of the Federation's elite combat specialists. His gaze lingered meaningfully on the human. Some of those somewheres may have been suffering from temporary insanity, but that remains to be seen. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the assembled students. Good. Fear mixed with admiration, exactly the response he'd spent centuries cultivating. In this class, you will learn to transcend the limitations of your species, to become weapons more deadly than any plasma cannon, more precise than any targeting computer. He began pacing the line, his forearms clasped behind his back in a pose that had been featured in no fewer than 7 military recruitment campaigns. You will suffer, you will bleed, those of you who have blood, that is. Some of you may even die, though I do try to keep that to a minimum. The paperwork is absolutely dreadful. He stopped in front of the human, looking down at her with all 6 eyes. This class has a 60% dropout rate. Those who cannot keep up are encouraged to leave quickly, and with whatever dignity they can salvage. I understand the Federation's Culinary Academy is always looking for new recruits. The human's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. How typical. Their species always did have trouble grasping the gravity of situations. Now then, Zix announced, spinning dramatically toward the center of the arena, his sash creating a perfect arc through the air. Let's see what you're made of. Literally, in some cases, he glanced at the gelatinous Morphean student, who had the grace to ripple embarrassedly. Who would like to demonstrate their current combat proficiency first? 20 hands of various shapes, sizes, and states of matter rose into the air. But Zix's 6 eyes were fixed on only one. It was time to see just how badly Admiral K. Thorne had lost his mind. Lieutenant Maya Chen stepped forward with a fluid grace that made several of her classmates' appendages twitch nervously. The Pyraxian closest to her actually took a crystalline step backward, their facets reflecting tiny rainbows of what could only be described as concern. Lieutenant Chen Zix drawled, managing to make her name sound like something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his ceremonial combat boots. Our first human applicant in the Advanced Combat Program's illustrious history. How? progressive of Admiral K. Thorne. "Thank you for the opportunity," Combat Master Chen replied, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been amusement or insubordination. With humans, it was notoriously difficult to tell the difference. A tentacled Zorlaxian student raised 3 of its sensory stalks. "Combat Master, I don't understand. How can a species from a Class 12 Deathworld be allowed in this program? Wouldn't their natural aggression make them too unstable?" "An excellent question," Zixthrax purred, all 6 eyes fixed on Chen. "Though I believe you have it backward. Humans aren't notorious for their aggression, they're notorious for their fragility. No natural armor, no backup organs, no evolutionary defenses worth mentioning. They're basically walking bags of mostly water." The class tittered, though the Morphean student looked slightly offended at the bag of water comment. "Their planet tries to kill them constantly," a serpentine Draconid student hissed thoughtfully. "Atmospheric electrical discharges, tectonic instabilities, aggressive flora and fauna, extreme temperature variations. And yet they survived," Chen interjected quietly. The room fell silent. "We didn't just survive, we thrived. We turned our weaknesses into strengths. No natural armor? We invented it. No claws? We forged better ones. No venom? We created chemicals that make most biological toxins look like refreshments at a children's party." Zixthrax's secondary heart did that annoying skipping thing again. There was something in her tone, a kind of steel under silk quality that made his combat instructor's instincts twitch. Yes, very inspiring," he cut in, waving 2 of his arms dismissively while the other 2 adjusted his sash. "But this is an advanced combat class, not a survival story symposium. Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate these supposedly superior adaptations." The human's smile reminded him uncomfortably of the apex predators from her homeworld, the ones that didn't need to look dangerous, because everything already knew they were. "Of course, Combat Master. Though I should probably warm up first. Wouldn't want to pull anything. Fragile." The way she said fragile made several students near her take another step back. Even the Nebulon's gas clouds seemed to contract slightly. Zixthrax felt his crest rising in irritation. In 300 years of teaching, he'd never met a student who could pack so much insolence into such a regulation-perfect stance. This was going to be interesting right up until she washed out of the program. "By all means, Lieutenant. Show us your warm-up." The training arena hummed to life, holographic barriers shimmering into existence as Zixthrax input the combat parameters with all 4 hands. He was showing off. Of course, the system could be operated with a single appendage, but there was something satisfying about the impressed murmurs from his other students. "Standard evaluation protocols seem a bit basic for someone of your supposed caliber," he mused, making a show of scrolling through various combat scenarios. "Perhaps something more challenging? The Rigelian Death Maze? The Vorpal combat simulation?" His mandibles clicked in what passed for a Centaurian smirk. "Or would that be too strenuous for your delicate human physiology?" The other students had arranged themselves in a semicircle, safely behind the barrier fields. The Pyraxian was recording the session with all of their facets, no doubt planning to sell copies later. Combat training videos featuring spectacular failures were always popular in the Academy's underground market. "Whatever you think is appropriate," Combat Master Chen replied, rolling her shoulders in a way that made several nearby students flinch. It was an oddly predatory gesture for such a supposedly fragile species. "Though I should mention we have a saying on Earth about assumptions." "How fascinating," Zixthrax deadpanned, deliberately ignoring the bait. "Computer, load combat scenario Omega-7. Full contact, minimal safety protocols," he paused for dramatic effect. "Unless that's too extreme." The human was doing stretches now, movements that seemed to defy several laws of anatomy. The Morphean student had to reform itself twice just watching her. "Omega-7 is fine," she said, dropping into a stance that looked deceptively casual. "Though you might want to increase the difficulty setting. Wouldn't want anyone getting bored." A low buzz of excitement rippled through the spectating students. The Nebulons were pulsing with anticipation, their gaseous forms swirling in agitated patterns. The Draconid scales were shifting colors rapidly, a sure sign of mounting tension. "Very well," Zixthrax announced, making a show of manipulating the controls. "Omega-7, difficulty level maximum. The scenario will begin with basic combat drones and escalate based on your performance. The record for this simulation, set by yours truly, stands at 17 minutes and 23 seconds. He stepped back, 2 arms crossed over his chest, the other two adjusting his sash with practiced nonchalance. Of course, that was against the standard difficulty setting. I wouldn't expect. Computer Chen interrupted, still maintaining that irritatingly relaxed pose. Please display Combat Master Zixthrax's vital signs alongside mine during the simulation. For educational purposes, of course. The absolute audacity. Zixthrax's crest fully extended, a physiological response he hadn't experienced since his own training days. I hardly think that's... Regulation 47B, subsection 12, she quoted, finally looking directly at him with those unsettling human eyes. Students have the right to request vital sign monitoring of any participant in training scenarios, including instructors, for comparative analysis. The Sorlaxian student's tentacles curled in what might have been suppressed laughter. Even the Morphian seemed to be vibrating with amusement. Very well, Zixthrax managed through clenched mandibles. Computer, comply with the lieutenant's request. Though I should warn you, Centaurian biology is significantly more advanced than human. My natural advantages will make this much more interesting. Chen finished for him, dropping into a lower stance that somehow managed to look both completely vulnerable and absolutely lethal. Shall we begin? The combat drones materialized, sleek, deadly machines programmed with centuries of combat data. At maximum difficulty, they were capable of overwhelming even the most seasoned warriors through sheer numbers and adaptability. Last chance to reconsider, Zixthrax offered, making a show of magnanimity for the benefit of the watching students. There's no shame in admitting when you're out of your depth. Well, minimal shame, some shame, a reasonable amount of. Computer Chen called out, her voice carrying an edge that made several drones actually pause in their activation sequence, begin simulation. As the arena's lighting shifted to combat mode and the first wave of drones began to move, Zixthrax had the strangest feeling that he'd somehow lost control of the situation. But that was ridiculous. After all, what could one small, fragile human possibly do to surprise a combat master with 3 centuries of experience? He was about to find out. One moment, please, Chen called out, just as the first drone was about to engage. I did mention needing to warm up first. Zixthrax's mandibles clicked in irritation. Lieutenant, the simulation has already... Computer, pause simulation, she commanded, and then proceeded to do something that made several students question their sensory organs' reliability. She dropped to the ground and began performing what appeared to be some kind of ritualistic self-torture. What? What is she doing? Whispered the Pyraxian, their crystalline structure vibrating with confusion. Push-ups, Chen answered between controlled breaths, her body rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Standard Earth military warm-up. Don't mind me, just need to do about 300 of these. 300. Zixthrax's secondary heart definitely had a problem. He'd need to see a medical professional about that. That's one-arm push-ups now, she interrupted, switching to her right arm without breaking rhythm. The display monitoring her vital signs showed barely any elevation in heart rate. Then the left. Have to keep things balanced, you know. The Morphian student had to actively concentrate on maintaining its humanoid shape as Chen smoothly transitioned to exercises that seemed to defy several principles of biomechanics. Her body moved in ways that made even the naturally flexible Draconid wince. Burpees next, she announced cheerfully, launching into a series of explosive movements that had the combat drones actually backing away. Their threat assessment protocols were apparently registering her warm-up as potential combat maneuvers. Computer, Zixthrax demanded, verify atmospheric composition. She must be accessing some form of performance enhancement through the air supply. Atmosphere nominal, the AI replied, with what he swore was a hint of amusement. Lieutenant Chen's performance is within documented human parameters. The human had moved on to something she called mountain climbers, though it looked more like she was trying to drive her knees through the reinforced floor plating. The Nebulon students had clustered together, their gaseous forms swirling in patterns that typically indicated existential dread. Just a quick set of pulling exercises and we'll be ready to go, Chen announced, approaching one of the structural support beams. What happened next caused the Sorlaxian to entangle 3 of its tentacles in shock. She began pulling herself up, over and over, switching grips and patterns in ways that made the beam itself creak ominously. The display showed her heart rate had finally increased to what she casually mentioned was about 50% capacity. Is that safe? The Draconid student asked, scales shifting to a concerned shade of mauve. Probably not, Chen replied, now hanging upside down and performing what she called inverted crunches, but neither is living on a planet that actively tries to kill you every day. You adapt. Zixthrax found himself unconsciously touching his ceremonial sash for comfort. The human's vital signs were displaying patterns he'd only seen in combat simulators designed to demonstrate theoretical peak performance. This wasn't just physical conditioning, this was evolution honed by millennia of survival on a death world, compressed into one unsettlingly cheerful package. "Almost done," Chen announced, dropping to the ground in a movement so fluid it made the Morphean student lose cohesion for a moment. "Just need to loosen up the joints." What followed was a series of stretches that had several students averting their various sensory organs. The Pyraxian actually developed a small crack from watching her casually bend in ways that suggested human bones were more of a suggestion than a requirement. Lieutenant Zixthrax managed, his voice slightly higher than usual. "Surely this is excessive for a simple combat demonstration." Chen paused in the middle of what appeared to be trying to touch her elbows behind her back, both in front and behind simultaneously. "Oh, this isn't the full routine," she said with that predator's smile. "Back on Earth, we'd follow this with a 10-kilometer run, some light calisthenics, and maybe a few rounds of hand-to-hand combat practice. But since we're short on time." She rolled her shoulders one final time, a motion that somehow managed to sound like crackling thunder in the suddenly very quiet arena. The combat drones had backed up against the far wall, their combat protocols apparently struggling to categorize what they'd just witnessed. "Now then," she said, returning to that deceptively casual stance, "I'm properly warmed up. Shall we begin?" Zixthrax looked at the vital sign display, which showed Chen's body operating at what should have been impossible levels of efficiency. He looked at his students, who were displaying various signs of species-specific distress. He looked at his combat drones, which seemed to be trying to calculate an escape route. Finally, he looked at the human, this supposedly fragile creature, who had just treated military-grade training equipment like a casual playground, and called it a light warm-up. For the first time in 3 centuries of teaching, Combat Master Zixthrax felt a sensation he'd thought long forgotten doubt. "Computer," he said, trying to keep his mandibles from clicking nervously, "reinitialize Omega-7 simulation." And he glanced at Chen, who was bouncing lightly on her toes in a way that made the floor plates resonate. "Activate maximum safety protocols." "Safety protocols?" Chen asked, raising an eyebrow. "I thought this was supposed to be challenging." The Draconid students' scales had shifted to the color of pure terror. The nebulons had condensed to their smallest possible volume. Even the Morphean had taken on a distinctly defensive shape. "Trust me," Lieutenant Zixthrax replied, all 4 hands moving to adjust his suddenly too tight sash. "I have a feeling we're about to redefine challenging for everyone involved." The combat drones reactivated, their weapons humming to life. Chen's smile widened just a fraction, but it was enough to make every predatory species in the room take an instinctive step back. Class was about to begin. The first drone never stood a chance. One moment it was advancing with textbook precision, the next it was sailing through the air in 3 separate pieces. Chen moved with a speed that made the Draconid student's natural striking reflex look positively glacial. "Interesting technique," Zixthrax commented, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. "Though perhaps a bit." The second and third drones went down before he could finish his sentence. Chen flowed between them like water through crystal lattices, her movements an impossible blend of efficiency and brutality. The Pyraxians' recording facets were working overtime, trying to capture every angle of the destruction. "Computer, increase drone deployment by 200%, Zixthrax ordered. Surely quantity would overcome whatever this was. Chen's laugh echoed through the arena. "Now it's getting fun." She dropped into what appeared to be a formal stance. "Let me show you something we call Krav Maga. It's what happens when you take all the rules out of fighting." What followed was less a combat demonstration and more a masterclass in creative destruction. Drones fell like autumn leaves on Earth, a terrifying concept the class had studied in xenobiology. Chen moved through their ranks using what she casually described as just a few basics from various Earth combat styles. "This is judo," she explained, using a drone's own momentum to send it crashing through 2 of its companions. "Great for when your opponent is bigger than you, which, given human-sized standards, is pretty much always." The Sorlaxian's tentacles were tied in sympathetic knots as they watched. "Muay Thai," she continued, her elbow reducing a drone's central processor to scrap while her knee simultaneously incapacitated another. "Everything is a weapon. Elbows, knees, shins. Humans learned to fight with whatever we had available." Zixthrax's combat analysis subroutines were approaching overflow. Computer, deploy heavy assault units. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Chen narrated, somehow managing to sound conversational while wrapping her body around a heavy assault drone in ways that defied several laws of physics. Really useful when the fight goes to the ground. Though I should mention, there was a screech of tearing metal. Most of these were designed to kill rather than disable. I'm actually being quite gentle. The Morphean had given up maintaining any specific shape and had reverted to a quivering puddle of anxiety. Lieutenant Zixthrax interrupted, all four arms gesturing in exasperation. This is meant to be a demonstration of tactical combat integration, not a terminology lesson in primitive earth violence. Chen paused in the middle of what she'd been describing as a simple arm bar, a hold that had somehow bent a military-grade combat drone into a shape that would make a modern artist question their life choices. You're right, Combat Master. My apologies, her smile turned positively predatory. Let me show you how we integrate instead. What happened next would be talked about in whispered tones throughout the academy for decades to come. Chen began combining techniques with a fluidity that made the Nebulon students look rigid. She flowed from one style to another, turning the arena into a symphony of calculated violence. Wing Chun for close quarters, she explained, her hands moving faster than some species could see. Capoeira for unpredictability, she actually flipped over a drone, using its confused targeting systems against its companions. Some good old-fashioned boxing, because sometimes you just need to hit things really, really hard. Zixthrax's secondary heart had given up on its regular rhythm and was now just improvising. Computer, maximum difficulty. Deploy all available units. All of them, Chen asked, sounding positively delighted. Well, in that case, she cracked her knuckles, a sound that made several students flinch. Time for my personal favorite. Computer, what's the current time? Current session duration 8 minutes, 12 seconds. Perfect. Plenty of time to break the record. The arena erupted in chaos as every available combat drone activated simultaneously. Chen's vital signs, still displayed prominently, showed her operating at what she offhandedly called a light jog level of exertion. This, she announced to the stunned classroom, is what happens when you take every combat style humans have developed over thousands of years of trying to kill each other, put them in a blender, and add a healthy dose of Deathworld practicality. What followed wasn't combat so much as it was performance art. Chen moved like she was made of liquid mercury, each motion flowing into the next with lethal precision. Drones fell by the dozens, then hundreds, their advanced combat protocols useless against what she termed good old-fashioned human unpredictability. You see, she explained, casually disassembling a heavy assault unit with her bare hands. Humans didn't develop these techniques in controlled environments. We created them in survival situations, often against superior forces. Every style you're seeing was born from necessity, refined by desperation, and perfected through the most rigorous testing program in the galaxy human history. Zixthrax watched as his carefully programmed combat drones, the pride of the Academy's training program, were systematically reduced to spare parts. His vital signs, still displayed next to Chen's eerily stable readings, showed significant stress responses. Computer, he managed, his voice barely maintaining its professional tone. Time. Session duration 15 minutes, 47 seconds. New record established. The last drone fell, its neural circuits scattered across 3 different sections of the arena. Chen stood in the middle of the destruction, looking for all the world like she'd just finished a light stretching session. That was invigorating, she said, surveying the mechanical carnage around her. Though I do feel bad about the mess. Earth habits die hard, we always try to clean up after ourselves. The class stared in stunned silence. The Pyraxians' recording facets had actually overheated. The Draconid scales had cycled through so many colors they'd temporarily exhausted their chromatophores. Zixthrax looked at his ceremonial sash, now slightly askew despite his best efforts. He looked at his students, each displaying their species' unique expression of awe and terror. Finally, he looked at the human who had just redefined every combat parameter in his 3 centuries of teaching. Class dismissed, he announced, all 4 arms falling limply to his sides. Lieutenant Chen, please see me in my office to discuss your training curriculum. As the students fled, some more literally than others, Chen began gathering drone parts into neat piles, humming what she called an old earthwork song. Her vital signs still hadn't exceeded what she considered a moderate workout. Oh, and Combat Master, she called out as Zixthrax turned to leave. Next time, feel free to take off the safety protocols. I wouldn't want anyone thinking humans need special treatment. For the first time in his career, Zixthrax had nothing to say. His secondary heart had officially given up on finding a regular rhythm and was now just focusing on keeping him upright. The Academy's combat training program would never be quite the same. In Zixthrax's office, the ceremonial sash lay forgotten across a chair, a first in Academy history. The combat master sat behind his desk, all 6 eyes fixed on Lieutenant Chen, who was casually leaning against the wall in a way that somehow made it look like both a relaxation technique and a combat stance. So he began, trying to find his usual authoritative tone and failing miserably. Perhaps we should discuss what happened in there. Of course, Chen nodded. I apologize if I went overboard. Sometimes we humans forget that what we consider reasonable force might seem a bit extreme to others. The Pyraxian student, who had refused to leave despite dismissal, chimed in from the doorway. But how? The historical records indicate humans were barely space-capable when they joined the Federation. Your combat techniques suggest millennia of development. Chen's laugh held an edge that made Zixthrax's primary heart join his secondary in arrhythmia. That's because before we reached for the stars, we spent most of our history reaching for each other's throats. Every technique you saw today was born from conflict, refined by necessity, and perfected through countless battles. But why the Draconid student had also stayed, their scales still cycling through colors of confusion and awe. Because Earth didn't just try to kill us, it taught us to kill everything else first. Chen's voice carried the weight of her species' violent history. We learned to fight from watching predators, developed strategies by surviving natural disasters, and honed our skills through endless wars. What you saw wasn't just combat training, it was the distilled essence of human survival instinct. Zixthrax found himself leaning forward despite himself. The drone analysis shows moves that shouldn't be possible with human physiology. The strain alone should have broken US. Chen's smile was almost gentle now. Combat master, humans are born broken. Our bodies are constantly repairing themselves. We heal from injuries that would kill most species, adapt to poisons that should destroy us, and grow stronger from damage that would cripple others. We didn't become apex predators on a death world by being fragile. The Morphean student, who had squeezed through the ventilation system to join the discussion, rippled with understanding. So when you said you were being gentle, I was using maybe 40% of what a human is capable of in actual combat conditions. The warm-up? That was just to make sure I didn't pull anything. Humans tend to perform better when we're slightly damaged. It triggers our survival responses. Zixthrax's professional demeanor finally cracked. Better when damaged. That's terrifying, Chen suggested. Yeah, we get that a lot. Why do you think we try so hard to seem non-threatening? The galaxy's a lot more comfortable when they think of us as those weird, fragile primates who somehow survived their death world through luck. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Pyraxian's crystals vibrated at a frequency that suggested deep contemplation. The Draconid scales had settled on a color that their species reserved for moments of profound revelation. I believe, Zixthrax said carefully, straightening his posture but not reaching for his sash, that I owe you an apology, Lieutenant. And perhaps the entire advanced combat program needs revision. Oh, Chen's eyebrow rose slightly. Yes, starting with the immediate integration of Earth combat techniques into the curriculum. And he managed what passed for a Centaurian smile. Perhaps you would consider a position as a guest instructor. Chen's predatory grin returned, but this time it held a hint of respect. I'd be honored, Combat Master, though we should probably requisition sturdier drones. As the students finally dispersed, discussing in hushed tones what they'd witnessed, Zixthrax found himself watching the human with new eyes. In 3 centuries of teaching, he'd never had to completely reevaluate his understanding of combat capability. Lieutenant, he called out as she turned to leave. That saying you mentioned earlier about assumptions. Ah, yes, Chen paused at the door. On Earth, we say that when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. She winked a disturbing human gesture that involved partially closing one eye. But in this case, I'd say it made for an excellent teaching opportunity. Zixthrax waited until she was gone before finally reaching for his ceremonial sash. He had a feeling he'd need all the comfort he could get when explaining to the Academy board why he needed a complete overhaul of the combat training program and a much, much larger drone budget.